I just want to speak very briefly about what it is. What is this universal Christ consciousness? Why do we call it universal and not just Christ consciousness? Part of that is simply to differentiate it from a religious perspective. And there's nothing wrong with a religious perspective if it works for you. That's fantastic. If it doesn't, we don't want to prevent other beings, other humans from accessing something that is beautiful simply because they don't resonate with the doctrine. So, part of what I do in my work is find a way, as best as I can, to open up the inner mystical truth of any path or tradition that I feel connected to, and to share that with you so that if you feel connected to it too, you also have a way of accessing it. So, the Christ consciousness, as I experience it and understand it, is profoundly universal in the sense that it belongs to all of humanity. It's an entirely human divine relationship. And the consciousness of that, the Christ consciousness, is about fruition or fulfillment. And there's certain qualities that manifest through Goddess Isis, Mother Mary, Horus and Yeshua, and even Kuan Yin and the goddess Tara, for example, that have these qualities in common, these kind of redemptive, transformational qualities that are at the heart of the Christ consciousness. But I think the most important thing that we need to recognize, I guess there's two things. One, it's about the fulfillment of who and what you are at a human level in a really unique way. And all of the beings that have expressed Christ consciousness whatever tradition they were in, have all been rebels. They've all got in trouble with the establishment. They always are asked by their connection with God or the goddess or the divine, however you want to describe it, to do something that flies in the face of societal convention, but is necessary for them to do in order to become fully who they are. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because when we're on our path, there's going to be times that we are really pushed to step into the fullness of what we believe ourselves to be born to do and how we need to be in our truth. And it's not often going to match with what the rules of society tell us we should be doing for our age or our gender or our belief system or our background, or to match with what everyone else is doing, or whatever it is that we are, whatever stereotypes we're breaking free from, because those are human conventions, human developments, human conditions, and the divine isn't particularly interested in them. They're not necessarily bad, but we have to be careful that we don't allow that desire to adhere to the things that we know and that others say to become stronger than our capacity to recognize and choose how we're going to respond to that inner spiritual voice of the divine fruition that's always guiding us from within. And at least in my experience, I'm so sorry, will fairly often tell us to move in a way that might even challenge our own expectations around how we think things are going to go, or what it is that we feel we're supposed to be doing. So there's that element of the rebellious. The other facet that's really important with Christ consciousness and is fairly universal is that it happens when everything's crazy. It happens when things are falling apart and when it looks like there's the most mess. So from a worldly perspective, it may not seem like that. From a spiritual perspective, it will definitely feel like that. You'll have a sense. In Taoism, they talk about the rise of the inferior man, and they're talking about a time, a kind of phase where things in society seem to be topsy turvy. So power is worshipped over love. Money and wealth goes to people or situations that might be exploitative rather than have integrity. The most respect is given to things that aren't really worthwhile, and the things that are worthwhile are considered secondary or easily dispensed with, for example. So when we think about that, we might look at society and say, well, that's a society that spiritually is insane, but materially is very prosperous, for example. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have prosperity and spirituality together. Of course you can. But this is really about recognizing that the Christ consciousness and the push for that kind of divine realignment or that divine courage to step beyond what feels comfortable or familiar in that moment is about a corrective mechanism, a saving mechanism, a realigning mechanism. It's about saying the way things are happening in the physical materialization at this moment are not so great. And spirit wants to do something about it, and it wants to do something about it through you and in such a way that you benefit, but also the collective benefit. So the Christ consciousness, even though it's incredibly personal and it's about our own relationship with whatever face of the divine ones we really resonate with that holds that consciousness. So that could be Christ, it could be Mother Mary, it could be Kuan Yin, it could be any avatar of Vishnu. So Krishna, it could be Rama, it could be Narasimha is one of my favorites. If we ever have a chance to talk about that story, I'd love to tell you more about him. Um, but whatever being it, Kuan Yin, Tara, whatever being you really resonate with, there's that face of Christ consciousness develops that personally for you. And through your fulfillment, you doing what you were born to do, there is a benefit. It's like when all the plants in the garden are growing into their own fruition, the whole garden benefits because they're part of this system. So I just wanted to say that. Now, we have this sense of what the Christ consciousness is in that spiritual facet. So let's talk a little bit about Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen. So Julian of Norwich, she was a recluse in the 14th century English, and she had visions of, well, of a Christ, but in unusual ways. So some of her visions were really so, on one hand, optimistic, but also quite challenging to the orthodoxy, to the traditional way of viewing Christ. And what I think about Julian of Norwich is that because she really took her time, she was kind of more of a slow bloomer. So she meditated on her visions, I think it was for around 30 years before she actually started to write about them. 20 years, forgive me. And in that process, there's really this sense of trusting in the timing and the fruition and not having to force things into place, but having this feeling of allowing them to kind of ripen and bloom. And I love that. Hildegard, on the other hand, so she wasn't particularly a slow bloomer, but she was a bit of a late bloomer. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But with Julian of Norwich, there's just this real sense of letting things kind of simmer and having patience to allow them to come together, which I don't know about you, but I find to be quite rare in this day and age. And I think some of us are really trying to find that as a kind of counterbalance to the relentless pace of modern life. So things like slow fashion and slow cooking and slow living and just being able to slow down full stop, even if it's just for a time, but where we balance the activity that can be so fast paced and relentless with this sense of also finding a deeper sense of patience and trust. So she really embodies this. She's also quite charmingly, I think, the patron saint, not only of contemplatives and hermits, but cats. Just love that. Anyway, some of her visions really focused on the sense of God as a loving presence. And the most optimistic aspect of her spirituality was just this sense of one of the most beautiful things you can give to God, Goddess, Mother, Divine Mother, however you conceptualize it, is living your life with gratitude and just living well with a sense of happiness. Isn't that beautiful? It's so simple and it's so sweet. And there is something in it. When I was reflecting on that, I was thinking of how we feel when we give someone a gift. And let's say you gave them a scarf and you see them wearing that scarf and they wear it with flair and they love it. And it's often part of their favorite outfit. And every time you see it, you feel this love and this joy that the gift that you gave that person has been accepted with so much relish and that they really enjoy it. We can imagine that kind of delight in the mind and the heart of the creator that gives life, or the universe, or whichever way you need to conceptualize this. But imagine that delight when you have that joy in your life in whatever moment. It might be something simple, it's simple cultivation of gratitude. It doesn't mean the other ups and downs and challenges don't exist, but there is this sense of returning to this gratitude and the value of that. So that's a little bit on Julian of Norwich. Her visions were interesting. There's kind of three qualities that really came through quite strongly for her: milk, blood, and water. So when we talk about milk, she talked about almost like a mother breastfeeding a child. She described Christ, our mother, as feeding us with his body. So it's kind of a metaphor for the crucifixion and for the spiritual nourishment. And similarly with the crucifixion, there was a moment where the side of Christ is speared and blood and water pours forth. And she compares this to the blood and water that's leaving the womb upon birth, and talks about the courage and the love of a woman in giving birth and how this is an affirmation of life, and then describes Christ as this kind of like the side of Christ, this suffering on the cross, as being this kind of spiritual birthplace, this womb space where humanity can seek shelter and be reborn spiritually. It's very beautiful. And as you can imagine, kind of shocking. No one really talked about that. So it's very unusual, but it mirrors this lovely conflation with Mother Mary as the beautiful womb of Christ, and also Goddess Isis in her secret amulet, the teat or the knot of Isis, the buckle of Isis, which was connected in some people's minds with the womb space and the blood mysteries, and Isis as the womb that brought forth Horus, which is this new masculine kind of Christ consciousness saving energy. So there's there. And then Kuan Yin is known for sprinkling waters that are curative and compassionate from her vase. So there are these kind of themes that run through with these three beautiful feminine beings as well. Now let's talk about Hildegard. She's a banging bird. Oh my God, she did so much in her life. So she's 12th century German. She's a nun and an abbess. So she founded her own abbey, as one does. And she also had visions from early on, from childhood. Now, I think what's really interesting with Hildegard, again, she waited for a long time. She didn't write anything till she was about early 40s, and she was around 42 before she started writing anything. And she persisted in her visions because she was fortunate enough to have a like a monk who was a mentor to her, who encouraged her, because she easily could have been put to death as a heretic. And I think it's important to note this because Hildegard in particular was similar to Julian of Norwich. She went against conventional doctrine in her interpretations, but she kind of took it a step further, and she was very active about it and very outspoken. At the time, there was social conventions from St. Paul who basically said, women should not be talking in public, and especially not to men, like, and especially not preaching, like it should not be having religious discussions. Well, Hildegard just like went on a public speaking tour 4 times and taught a lot of men. So she just did what she wanted to do, which was just unheard of, but she did it anyway. And she had a lot of capacity to move in the world in a way that's really quite inspiring. And she was known for her passion around music. She saw it as being a form of divine worship. So she wrote music. She was living in a time when a lot of female performance art was just not allowed. So women were being replaced by men in roles. And I mean, one of her responses to that was she just wrote a musical and put her nuns in it. And they all performed. And the thing I love, her mentor played the role of Satan in her musical. It's fabulous. So she wrote this musical. She wrote about her visions. She explored healing. She believed that um, natural things like plants, gemstones, even fish could have healing properties and could help us heal. And she talked about nutrition and well-being and moderation. So she was very much ahead of her time. But because she just took so long really to get started, I mean, she more than made up for it, but it took her a while. I think of her as like the patron saint of late bloomers, and Julian of Norwich of slow bloomers. So there are these beautiful unrushed qualities, and yet they bring forth this amazing body of work. And Hildegard, even in her 80s, was still like causing kerfuffle. There was a situation where some poor chap had offended someone in the church. I don't know what he'd done. Said blasphemed or done something. And one of the, I can't remember if it was an archbishop, but it was someone who was quite high up in the church, had kind of wanted his body to be exhumed from the grave and been taken out of um, a Christian burial site and put somewhere else. And she intervened and just said, "No, I refuse to do it. You have to believe in God's grace and God's compassion." This person, relented and asked for, confessed or whatever he needed to do, and asked for forgiveness. And you need to have forgiveness. So there was something in her of not bowing to authority and not being afraid to speak up when really someone was being, what would we say, disconnected from heart, wisdom, and compassion, and really affirm her sense of the divine as love. So she's really quite an amazing woman. And part of her visions kind of worked with a little bit similar, the similarities of Julian of Norwich, but there's some distinction as well. So one of her aspects that comes through that's really quite powerful is this idea of greening and tantra. Now, she didn't use the word tantra, but it's what she's describing. And she basically said that you can't have the feminine without the masculine, or the masculine without the feminine, in any way, but especially when you're connecting with the idea of the divine, and believe that you're going to be having a complete experience. We need these things together. And she had this vision of a cosmic egg. And within the egg, there was this divine being that was androgynous, half male, half female, and was reaching out with this kind of embrace and just radiating this love. And she saw this as like a Christ figure. And it reminded me so much of the the hepet in Egyptian, the embrace posture. It's like when the arms are reaching forward. You can see the goddess Isis assuming this posture quite often, when she's depicted kind of standing behind Horus on the throne. And also Isis is known as the egg of the goose, because her father, Geb, is the earth god, and the goose is one of his sacred symbols. So she's sometimes known as that egg. And I loved that kind of synchronicity. And there's also these elements with Tantra and greening. She saw the green space of the earth as being where the divine feminine is, where Christ as mother, Christ as God is, and God as mother can be found. So there is this understanding with Hildegard of the immanent divinity. So what that means is it's not separate. There's transcendent divinity, which is more the masculine. It's that part that is always there, eternal light. No matter what's happening on earth, it is consistently what it is. It's not unmoved, but unsullied. It's transcendent, it's beyond. And that's important. It reminded me of the poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, where she just has this line, earth's crammed with heaven, which I just love. And it's this sense that whilst there is this transcendent divinity that we can connect to in prayer, we also can realize that the divine is with us, in us, amongst us, where we need it, when things are going crazy in our lives or when we need that support. There's something so beautiful about that. And it reminded me, this idea of this greening, as the energy of Osiris. So Osiris, the beloved of Isis, who she heals through her journey, and then with him gives birth to Horus, the new Christ energy. So in that kind of Egyptian universal Christ consciousness myth, the color green is important. It's the skin of Osiris, it's the energy of regeneration, it's the color of the healed eye of Horus that's connected with Horus and his divine purpose. Um, it's just this color of fertility and life in so many traditions. And to see that coming through in Christian mysticism is actually quite beautiful. And again, kind of unusual. And one of the ways that Hildegard described the body of Mary, I thought was beautiful. And she said it like Mary is, oh, how did she say it? God putting on human form. That's what she said. So Mary is God putting on human form, because without Mary, there could be no Christ. And when we think about some of our struggles with reconciling the material world and the spiritual dimension, sometimes we can struggle with that, with money, with sexuality, with any phase of just the body itself, and this idea of original sin, for example. There can be a great struggle around that. and around just loving our humanity and feeling worthy and being able to connect with that divinity and releasing this kind of false shame and guilt, and instead being able to say, this is my experience as a human being. How can I live it fully in connection with this divine essence within me? What is it that wants to become through me? Not feeling that I am unworthy of it, or that I am separate from it in some way, and instead just being able to embrace it and allow that sense of divine love to be part of our daily lives, in the trees around us, in the food that we eat, in the air that we breathe, and feel that this is sacred. The physical is sacred, not just the transcendent, beautiful, numinous experiences that we have, as wonderful as they are, but that's not the whole story of being human. So to have a divinity that is here with us when we're going through the struggle and the pain as well, I think is exquisite and really important. So when we kind of put all this together, there is this beautiful sense of connection between the physical world and the heavenly world, and this sense of this kind of secret unity that we may not always feel, but every mystic that I am aware of has this sense of this oneness, this unity of this divinity with us and within us always. The last thing I'll say about Hildegard before we move on to have a chat about the esoteric parallels with Mother Mary, Isis, and Kuan Yin is just this last element that she talked about of the clouds. She had this vision of the clouds like releasing rain, similar to Julian of Norwich, this idea of like the clouds like breasts releasing the milk to nourish life through the rain. And that also reminded me of Isis, who was conflated with the goddess Sopdet, who, with the inundation and with the rising of Sirius every year in ancient Egypt, would bring forth the rains, which would bring life, fertility, greenness back to the desert and allow for the Egyptian civilization to flourish and continue for another year ahead. So there is this connection with the divine, with abundance and restoration, and that is that greening, that sense of life. And just when you're reflecting on this in your own heart, what this universal Christ consciousness might mean for you, and how you relate to it, think of it too about what it is that wants to come to life in you. I think sometimes we can focus in this terrain because of perhaps all the emphasis on the crucifixion, rightly or wrongly. It's an amazing, astonishing thing, but it's also one part of this great mystery and story. There are these parts that happen later that I think are so important, around the resurrection, around the transformation of Christ, around this whole legacy of what Christ talked about is possible for human beings. But I just think it's important when reflecting on this that we don't get consumed in the aspect of that energy of loss or that energy of death, and we focus on the energy of life, which is actually what Isis is about, what Christ is about. I'll tell you this last little story before we move on to the next part. I was actually at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Israel not so long ago, and there's the slab where it's said that the body of Christ was placed after the crucifixion, and the energy in that little church is pretty incredible. And I was standing near it, and just people were, throwing themselves on the on the slab and wiping it with white cloth, and there was so much intensity in that space. People were similar to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem that I visited as well. This intensity of people wanting to connect with the divine. And I was standing kind of in the background a little bit while these people were in front and just feeling it. And I felt this massive surge of grief, and just for the crucifixion and how awful it was. And then I had this voice in my head, that just this beautiful voice that just said, "Why do you weep, child, when you know that I live?" And the tears suddenly stopped, and I was like, what just happened? And I thought, this is the voice of Christ. This is this beautiful reminder of the joy and the life that we've been given, and how easy it is to get caught up in so much negativity, pain, and suffering, which is part of our human existence. There's no way around that. It's there. All beings find suffering at certain times, and to have compassion and acknowledge that is wise, but that's not the whole story. And remembering this sense of how our spiritual path can bring us into a connection with love, with courage, with fortitude, with wisdom, with a connection of how do we want to be alive? How do we want to live with this precious one time only. Even if you believe in reincarnation, which I do, this is still one time, one time only. This particular incarnation that we have, what do we want to do with it? How do we want to live it? And so then we have this beautiful sense of support for this from these wonderful rebels like Isis, Kuan Yin, Mother Mary, Christ, and so on that actually help us get to these places.